So, good afternoon. My name is Kevin Carpenter. I'm a volunteer with Cppcon, and I'm here with Matthew Butler to talk to him about his upcoming talks at Cppcon this year, as well as other items we got to cover today. Nice to meet you, Matthew.
Yeah, you too. Thanks for having me on.
So, for the people that don't know you, you want to give a little background and history on yourself?
So I've been working with C++ as a professional since 1990. And most of it's been in the security industry in some form or fashion, whether it's writing network security tools or writing systems that have to work behind those security tools, and a certain amount of information security work on the other side. I started my career as a hacker back in high school, so I sort of did the breaking into BBSs and trying to find ways to exploit computers, not really to do any damage, but just to prove that I could do it. So.
Back when they would just take our computers away because we were under 18.
Yeah, back where my parents didn't even really understand what a computer was, so they couldn't very well take it away.
Exactly. Or why was the phone ringing at the middle of the night all the time and a fax sound on the other side?
Yeah, I've gotten in trouble for more than a few times when I had people calling me in the middle of the night, especially with BBSs. It was all 300 baud modems. So.
Oh yeah, that's for sure. So I have to say, as a volunteer, I had to make sure to block time out because on Monday you've got, your talks back to back, and I'm excited to go to them. You want to tell about the talk a bit?
Yeah, so I'm doing two talks. It's really looking at security in two ways. The first is, what are the kinds of vulnerabilities that we build into our systems? What are some of the sharp edges in C++? We'll talk a little bit about the industry, about hackers think, about how they see our code, and about the things they look for when especially if you're writing something that's like an open source library. What are the kinds of things they're going to go after? At the end of the first talk, we're going to do an exploit. So I'll walk through sort of the classic buffer overflow exploit. We'll talk about some of the mitigations we put into the operating systems, and then we'll go run it live to penetrate a box and get root access. The second talk is, okay, now that we've identified the problems, what do we do to address those problems? How do we mitigate those in our code? So we'll talk about things like intrusion kill chains. We'll talk about things like threat modeling. How do you use fuzz testing? How do you use static and dynamic testing in order to make sure that the code that we're putting out on the street is as tight as far as its security as we can? And a lot of it really comes down to is that we have a tendency to make very small, very subtle mistakes. And because we don't really recognize how a hacker would exploit those things, we're not really sure which tools will handle which types of mistakes. And then at the end of the second talk, we'll do a different exploit. This will be one that's a little more modern that will actually work today.
Oh, nice.
So by the time they walk out of the class, they should, or the two talks, they should have had a pretty good overview of, here are the things we do to make our code vulnerable, and then here are the things we can do to make sure that what goes out the door doesn't have those vulnerabilities anymore.
So I have to ask, because as I understand, the talk focuses more on the modern C++. Do you think that we've gotten at least better in our language capabilities to help some of this? I just think of the for loops that would run rampant before in C++, 98, and even C in some old code that I've seen.
Yeah, we're definitely actually making the language itself more secure. In fact, SG12 is the study group for vulnerabilities inside the ISO committee, so there is a focus on that. I think the place where we aren't doing as good a job is a lot of times you'll see in a code listing, you'll see someone will say error checking removed for clarity. Well, a lot of the production code I deal with every day has had the error checking removed for clarity, and not in a good way. And so one of the problems we run into that is sort of independent of the language is sort of the number one sin that we create when it comes to adding vulnerabilities into our code is we don't validate and verify. So we don't verify who we're talking to, and we don't validate what they're sending us. And there are still things, especially if you're dealing with legacy code, but there are still things that can still burn you. Now, a lot of those things are in the C part of C++. They're in some of the C++ 98. So the really good example is in C++ 17. If you just take an integer and you statically cast it to an enumeration, which a lot of people do without range checking it, it used to be that was unspecified value. So if it's out of range, it becomes unspecified value. If you do it in C++17, that's undefined behavior. And if you go look at C++, if you look at the spec, you'll find there's almost 300 mentions of undefined something in the specification. So those are the sharp edges. And if we don't know where those are and we accidentally step on them, then we have put a vulnerability into our code. And what I tell everybody is every vulnerability is a bug, but not every bug is a vulnerability. It all depends on where it is and the things that you can do with it. So in C++, in the modern C++, we've added strongly typed enumerations. So once you added that even if you aren't range checking it, it's no longer undefined behavior, because as long as you're using the same type, you're safe. Now you still have a problem that you now have data that you didn't validate to make sure that that data is actually correct for the context. So you wind up having to, you wind up having the same problem. It's just not nearly as bad. So probably the number one sin we have is we do not validate the data very well, especially when it crosses a trust boundary.
Right. So I understand as well that you've got a panel together that you're going to be doing on Thursday, is it?
Yeah, absolutely. So Thursday from 12:30 to 1:30, we're going to have a software security panel. Now, this is not the Friday panel. The Friday panel, after Chandler's talk, they're going to be talking specifically about Spectre and Meltdown, which should be, and his talk should be fascinating, and so should their panel. What we're going to be dealing with is we're going to be dealing with the language. We're going to be dealing with how do people exploit code? How do they see code from the outside? So any questions, and it's open mic, so any questions that people have on security, they can come and ask. And so we have a really good group. So we have Patricia Oz, who runs TurtleSec, and she's doing 2 talks, one on Tuesday and one on Wednesday. We have Matt Miller from Microsoft, who actually works on hardening Microsoft to these kinds of exploits that we tend to see. And they are doing he should be fascinating, because they're doing a really interesting, they've taken a very interesting approach to how they're actually hacking their systems from the outside, which is probably a lot of fun, but it's also very helpful. And then Michael Wong from CodePlay, who is on the standards committee and also works a lot on vulnerabilities and trying to take them out of the language. So we have, I think, a very good group of panelists, and our own Ava Conti is going to be moderating. So many people will know her from being the lodging liaison for Cppcon.
Excellent. So you mentioned, oh, I was going to say you got a lot of other talks mentioned in there. Are there any other talks, security domain specific or otherwise, that you're looking forward to seeing this year?
Well, I think besides Patricia's talks, we have Chandler's talk on Friday. And I think 5 is about all the talks we had this year. And it's sort of been interesting because this is not something that gets talked about very often at Cppcon. And then we sort of had this confluence where suddenly we had a lot of talks on security. So the subtext of Cppcon this year really is all around security. So we have 5 talks and then 2 panels where people will have plenty of opportunities to come and ask questions. Excellent.
So any thoughts for newcomers to Cppcon that are coming? Any hints for them on their first time?
Well, strangely enough, this is actually my first time as well. So I have sort of a strange distinction in that I'm on 5 committees that plan Cppcon, but I've never actually, this will be my first time attending. And this will also be my first time talking at Cppcon. So it was sort of strange to attend it and talk the first time. The ones that I'm looking forward to are Sean Parent's talk. Obviously, he's doing his Better Code series, which I absolutely love. I listened to the previous talks a lot. Jason Turner is actually in my meetup. I'm based out of Denver, so I see Jason once a month and at our meetup. And his talks, I've already seen sort of a preview of one of his talks, so they're really excellent. Bob Stiegel has 2 really interesting talks that he did at C++ Now, but they're well worth going to, especially if you're interested in some of the deeper design patterns that really make your job a lot easier. And then Michael Case. I come from the embedded world, so anytime I get a chance to go to Michael Case's talks, he's somebody that I always try and get into his.
That's interesting you say that, because that was Odin as well. When I was interviewing with him, he said he was looking forward to Michael's talk too. So that's what we had for today. I was just wanting to make sure to get with you on your plans for the convention, and that's awesome. It's your first time. That's a really busy schedule for being your first time going to the convention.
Yeah, and I was very fortunate because I know you had Kate on the other day, and she and Scott Myers and Andre are doing a class on Sunday right before the conference, and they opened it up to first-time speakers. So I get to go to that class before. So yeah, I have a very busy conference, and then there's a lot going on, and a lot that especially when you're working on the planning of the conference too. So I'm sure I'm going to have a very busy week.
I'm sure you will. I'm looking forward to it, and I look forward to your talk on Monday when we get there. Thank you again for your time this afternoon, and we'll see you at the conference.
Great. Thanks for having me.